Sure, we just discussed that we're starting at the top of 656 in the first complete edition in English translated by Bruce Fink. Have they not heard one of those dreams by which the dreamer remains overwhelmed, having in the felt condition of an inexhaustible rebirth, plumbed the depths of the pain of existence? And now he's talking about melancholic patience insofar as that melancholy had something to do with nationalism. That was just without going too deep into the details of what we were talking about right before this page. Or in order to put hell's torments back in their place, torments which could never be imagined beyond what men traditionally inflict in this world, shall we implore them to think of our everyday life as having to be eternal? We must hope for nothing, not even hopelessness, to combat such stupidity, which is, in the end, sociological. I am mentioning it here only so that people on the outside will not expect too much concerning Sade from the circles of those who have a surer experience of forms of sadism, especially regarding a certain equivocal notion that has been gaining ground about the relation of reversion that supposedly unites sadism with a certain idea of masochism. It is difficult for those outside such circles to imagine the muddle this notion creates. We would do better to learn from it the lesson contained in a fine little tale told about the exploitation of one man by another, which is the definition of capitalism as we know. And socialism, then? It is the opposite. Unintended humor. This is the tone with which a certain circulation of psychoanalysis occurs. It fascinates people because it goes, moreover, unnoticed. But there are doctrinaires who strive for tidier appearances. There are those who notice. One acts the part of a do-good existentialist, another, more soberly, that of a ready-made personalist. This results in the claim that the sadist denies, quote, denies the other's existence, unquote, which is precisely, one must admit, what has just come out in my analysis. Oh, pardon me, sorry about that. To pursue my analysis, is it not the case rather that the sadist discharges the pain of existence into the other, but without seeing that he himself thereby turns into an eternal object, if Whitehead is willing to let us have this term back? But why wouldn't it belong to both of us? Isn't this redemption and immortal soul the status of the Christian? Let us not proceed too quickly so as not to go too far either. Let us note instead that Sade is not duped by his fantasy insofar as the rigor of his thinking is integrated into the logic of his life. Let me give my readers an assignment here. The fact that Sade delegates a right to jouissance to everyone in his republic is not translated in my graph by any symmetrical reversal along an axis or around some central point, but only by a 90-degree rotation of the graph as follows. V, the will to jouissance, leaves no further doubt as to its nature, because it appears in the moral force implacably exercised by the president of Montreuil, Sade's mother-in-law, on the subject. It can be seen that the subject's division does not have to be pinned together in a single body. And let us note that it is only the first consul, Napoleon, who seals this division with its effective administratively confirmed alienation. This division here pins together as S, the brute subject incarnating the heroism characteristic of the pathological in the form of faithfulness to Sade manifested by those who at first tolerated his excesses, his wife, his sister-in-law, and why not his manservant too, and others who have been effaced from his history. For Sade, Bardes, we finally see that, as a subject, it is through his disappearance that he makes his mark. Things having come to their term. Incredibly, Sade disappears without anything, even less than for Shakespeare, of his image remaining to us, after he gave orders in his will to have a thicket efface the very last trace on stone of a name that sealed his fate. Something, not to be born, to never have been born. That's a Greek translation. Sade's curse is less holy than Oedipus's, and does not carry him towards the gods, but is immortalized in his work, whose unsinkable buoyancy Jules Janine backhandedly shows us, saluting it behind the books that hide it, if we are to believe him, in every worthy library, like those of St. John Chrysostom or Pascal's Penseus. But Sade's work is annoying, according to you, yes, like thieves at a fair. Your honor and member of the Académie Française, but his work always suffices to bother you, one of you by the other, both one and the other, and one in the other. A fantasy is, in effect, quite bothersome, since we do not know where to situate it, due to the fact that it just sits there, complete in its nature as a fantasy, whose only reality is as discourse, and which expects nothing of your powers, asking you, rather, to square accounts with your own desires. The reader should now reverentially approach those exemplary figures who, in the Sadean boudoir, assemble and disassemble in a carnival act like rite, a change of positions. It is a ceremonial pause, a sacred scansion. Let us salute here the objects of the law, of which you will know nothing unless you know how to find your way around in the desires those objects cause. It is good to be charitable, but to whom? That is the question. A certain Monsieur Verdot answered this question every day by putting women in an oven until he himself got the electric chair. He thought that his family wanted to live in greater comfort. More enlightened, the Buddha offered himself up to be devoured by those who did not know the way. Despite this eminent patronage, which might well be based solely on a misunderstanding, it is not clear that a tigress enjoys eating Buddha. Verdoux's abnegation stemmed from an error that deserves to be dealt with severely, since a little lesson from the critique, which does not cost much, would have helped him avoid it. No one doubts but that the practice of reason would have been both more economical and more legal, even if his family would have had to go hungry now and then. But what's with all these metaphors, you will say, and why? So on and so on. The molecules that are monstrous insofar as they assemble here for an obscene jouissance awaken us to the existence of other more ordinary jouissances encountered in life, whose ambiguities I've just mentioned. They are suddenly more respectable than these latter, appearing purer in their valences. Desires, here are the only
Maybe we
things...
should stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we have been reading like 2 pages. Well, I just want to mention the fact that he's right now, it's not just his life, but he Lacan is exemplifying how you can have like a reversal, right? In which he becomes the object, right? Of the, so he's taking the masochist position, right? Which is not necessarily like a symmetry between the sadist and masochist, right? This is like how Freud understood sadism, sadomasochism, right? There is like a symmetry between sadism and masochist, right? Or maybe, yeah, I think that's right. But here he's showing that it's not symmetrical, right? It's actually a 90-degree rotation, right? And in which there is a causation, right? So in this case, goes the A, the Sade in this case, right, tries to be the object of his mother-in-law, right? And that subjectivizes him, right, as a divided subject, and creates this pathological subject that he wants to get rid of, right? So, yeah, I don't know what someone else has in mind.
Yeah, I'm comparing schema 2 to schema 1, and I see Luis's point that schema 2 is meant to be applied not to the other that is imposed upon in the new transcendental Sadian fantasy, but this is actually meant to be applied to de Sade himself. I find that the position of V as will to jouissance and then small d below, I was slightly confused about the logic of small d as like its place. Is it correct to assume that this is where the position of the consul or Napoleon or the state emerges? Because there is a prop in the movement from V down to Bard's subject, V being will to jouissance, which is the stand-in for like the I don't know, the grantor or the authority figure or something like that. But what is D?
So D in the first graph is desire, right?
Yeah,
So that's related to the voice. Like there is a,
right,
because this is compared with Kant, right? Because for
right.
Kant, desire cannot cause virtue, right? Or the will, right? So here with Sade, we have this more honest reveal that there is desire in the voice, right? Because we see the voice in the other, coming from the other, right? So the D is desire. Yeah, so I don't really know why exactly D is in the same position, right? Even though the thing has changed 90 degrees, why D is in the same position. But I guess that this position belongs to the unconscious, right? To the unconscious
Yeah.
within the subject, right? So I guess that's desire of the unconscious. That's what my guess is, right? I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to be like as if desire in the second schema is addressing the split subject. I mean, if you look at this other paragraph, I don't think we got to it yet, but it's on the page 658 where he says desire here are the only things that bind them, and they are exalted in making it clear that desire is the other's desire. So it has to be coming from the outside, hitting the subject from a different position to be able to address, right?
Right.
Whereas like in the first graph at 653, as Luis said, it's desire aiming at the little a, which is tied with the voice, right? The voice of the other. But it's not necessarily like addressing the agency of the subject, but affecting the subject to make a choice. Whereas like D is like making the subject act, the split subject at least in the second graph.
So the other point I wanted to make, that's very helpful, thank you, is that the association of these Catholic figures, Jules Janine, Saint John, and Pascal, as we know, are perverts, but the use of object A as an instrument, meaning like the fact that Pascal literally died with the formula of the pensée by his heart as an object that he held to, is why he says that the fate is different than Oedipus, because the end of the instrument of Sade is his work itself. So I'm a little bit confused as to why we have a non-castrated S at the conclusion and not an A, or why we don't have an SA. Where A goes is sort of a confusing point to me. Why do you guys think it ends with this S? Any thoughts on that?
So the S is the pathological subject,
Right.
right? So
Right.
I guess this is what he wants to annihilate at the end, right? Not to be born, maybe, right? That's my guess.
Well, that's interesting. So in that sense, no, it's to fuse fully with nature, which is why he makes the reference to the gravesite, which I've already mentioned several times, right? It's this, so it's S as like fusion into the symbolic, right? It's not, again, it's not like S small a, it's not S imaginary, it's okay, so
It then makes me think then Freud's problem of the economic it's the economic problem of masochism, to which I mean his original like theory of the death drive is like this return to inanimate matter.
Yep.
And so like with Luis pointing out like this 90-degree turn to which this second schema is actually the position of Sade, to which I mean he doesn't look for a masochist. He ends up like reverting to the sort of economic problem of masochism with the drive to return to inanimate matter. And so like if you look at the schema, it's not that the split subject ends up going up to V to address little a, it ends up going to a pathological S, a pathological subject. it's like as if like it can't address the object cause of desire as voicing gaze, and it ends up like reverting back to itself as a sort of subject, a subject that's split and pathological. I mean, it makes me think of like in a pervert, when the gaze is put onto them as a sort of split subject, it has to do with like this sort of cruelness put onto them where it's like disgust and shame, and maybe disgust and shame has a sort of masochistic effect to make him want to return to nothing but inanimate matter and not a subject or an object. I don't know. I mean, that's just my speculation.
Yeah, I mean that's the movement that Lacan refers to as the movement of scansion, that these 90-degree angles are meant to represent, going down and then across, and that this entangles, and he says it entangles the reader in a kind of in a fantasy relation, but also as almost like a annoyance or like a frustration, which of course I immediately can relate to. Let us salute here the objects of the law, of which you will know nothing unless you know how to find your way around in the desires those objects cause. It is good to be charitable, but to whom? That is the question. Yeah, go ahead.
I think now that I read again, so the S, the final pathological subject, is on the side of the other, right? Also on the side of the of President Montreal, right?
Oh yeah,
Such
Luis,
mother-in-law.
do you have your supplementary graphs that explain
Oh,
with Sade that you can share on the screen with us? Is it digital or is it not digital?
I will have to search it first.
See if you have it digitally.
Yeah,
Maybe you
yeah,
could put them up for us, because I feel like that would actually help be a very instructive device for us.
yeah. I will search, but right now I want to mention that. So the S is on the side of the other, right? So and I think that's why he says here that the division here pins together as S as the brute subject incarnating the heroism characteristic of the pathological in the form of faithfulness to Sade, manifested by those who had first tolerated his excess. So the ones that are suffering, the mother-in-law, the sister-in-law, the others that suffer his excesses, right? So the pathological subject are those others that suffer his excesses, right? So in this case of him being the object, right?
Yeah, I think I'm following, although I think that more reading through will help us. But please do see if you can find those supplementary, because I know I was looking at them and they actually were very instructive. It might be useful. Um, that might be useful for us. Other thoughts on this, guys? Matilda, how are you reading it?
I'm a bit lost. Just thinking, I don't have a thought yet.
Okay. Okay, where were you? Where were you, Matan?
I just finished. It is good to be charitable, but to whom? That is the question.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, no, I kept reading. Sorry, pardon me.
Yeah, you went
If
farther
you,
than that.
yeah.
But
Desire.
why don't you pick up and we can go back over a certain Mansour and go from there.
Sure thing. A certain Monsieur Verdot answered this question every day by putting women in an oven until he himself got the electric chair. He thought that his family wanted to live in greater comfort. More enlightened, the Buddha offered himself up to be devoured by those who did not know the way. Despite this eminent patronage, which might well be based solely on a misunderstanding, Verdoux's abnegation stemmed from an error that deserves to be dealt with severely, since a little lesson from the critique, which does not cost much, would have helped him avoid it. No one doubts but that the practice of reason would have been both more economical and more legal, even if his family would have had to go hungry every now and then. But what's with all these metaphors, you will say, and why? The molecules that are monstrous insofar as they assemble here for an obscene jouissance awaken us to the existence of other more ordinary jouissances encountered in life, whose ambiguities I have just mentioned. So there I see some kind of like potential charge of special interest running through, or something that has to do with disinterest, that distinction. They are suddenly more respectable than these latter, appearing pure in their valencies. Desires, here are the only things that bind them, and they are exalted in making it clear that desire is the other's desire. If you have read my work up to this point, you know that, more accurately stated, desire is propped up by a fantasy, at least one foot of which is in the other, and precisely the one that counts, even and above all, if it happens to limp.
Okay, so it's kind of hard to get our heads around this because we're talking about like a strange, almost like operation of a machinic funneling of a desire as a particular desire funneled through this sadistic machine where it's like there's a then a product in a way, right? In the sense that even the mathemes of the discourses give you a product. And here the product is the pathological subject in schema 2, but that is for Sade himself. In the other schema, we also have the outcome of the S. And Luis, in schema 1, how are we to understand the S? How do you understand the S at the very end of the arrow?
So that's the pathological subject, right? So the S is not the signifier here, right? It means the subject, the pathological subject, right? So in the first graph, yes, that's what
Got it.
needs to
It's
be
the same in both.
Yeah.
The
So
same
it
in both.
was
Thank you.
what
Yeah.
needs to be scorned, right? It needs to be rejected.
Okay, yes, got it. It is very interesting that the Buddha is, you guys know why the Buddha is invoked here? Right? Isn't it because Buddhism seeks the annihilation of desire?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And then these ascetic religious figures do the same.
Mm-hmm.
But Sade's operation is fundamentally inverted from theirs. Okay, we don't need to go into that, but that's kind of the. But then to Akshay's point that he's always making, then still there is something like a facing of this perverse structure at the end or at the outcome.
Not to cut off Mathilda, but I watched that episode that Garrick posted, and it was just the only things he was accused of was like sodomy, I think, at some point. So it's not exactly like sodomy and blasphemy, right? Like, so it's not exactly, he didn't go around raping little children like it's, but and stuff.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matilda.
I'm wondering if we can locate the death drive in this schema, and if the death drive is related to kind of like the Kantian imperative. Like, is there something, I mean, he was saying earlier about like where our moral life is like divided between two things and that we're torn apart by it. And it seems like there are two things that tear us apart, which is kind of like whatever the death drive and its object is, which may be like evanescent or not real in a certain regard, and then like different, just like everyday pathological wishes that it kind of parasites through. I'm just wondering if the death drive is relevant at all in this.
Yeah, that's a good question because there's these two levels of jouissance. There's some operation that's happening on what he calls monstrous jouissance here on page 658.
Yeah,
if we go ahead.
Sorry, like it seems like the death drive, like it seems like in this essay there's also kind of this like reinterpretation of, well, at least like a clarification about the death drive. Like for Freud it's like a death wish or something, or a demand for death, but it seems like whatever is related to this like disappearance is perhaps also like maybe does Sade clarify something about the death drive or something? I'm just, yeah, I'm confused. I'm confused.
Yeah. Well, in a certain sense, let's, Ellie, please welcome back and please jump in.
Thank you. I guess I'm thinking about, and I have not been with you all for the prior sessions on this text, like since you started reading, but I guess I'm thinking about kind of this enigmatic quality of desire and how and fantasy, and how we don't get to necessarily decide what it is that we want, right? Because it's the other's desire. And how that's kind of put in juxtaposition here with like using law and reason, which are less enigmatic in a sense, maybe, but still part of the other.
Correct. Yes. 100%. That doesn't quite get at the location of the death drive, but I actually do think that Lacan is going to be making some intimations in that direction. And also when we reference the commentary in the ethics seminar as this Heideggerian being towards death of Antigone in relationship to de Sade, we'll see that as well. Because yeah, you would have to ask sort of what is being towards death for the pathological subject at the end of the schema, or as the result of this operation. That is an important question. And also why the D emerges in the first instance in schema 1, but emerges in the third instance in schema 2, right? I suppose that's because the first schema is a portrayal of the operation as done onto the other, whereas the second schema is portrayed as de Sade's singular movement through it. Andrew.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, yes, like of course the death drive does have to relate with all of this, even if it doesn't seem to be implicit within the schema. The little d is of course desire. But in the process, the death drive, okay, like for the original one, the death drive for Freud and even for Lacan in sadism is the sort of cruel destruction of the other projected onto the other. And of course, it still aligns with the original thesis of how the death drive for Freud is not only the return to inanimate matter, but it also can project onto the other as a sort of cruel or destructive tendency. And in some cases, it could end in like necrophilia, not in the literal sense of, but like this love for death. I know Erich Fromm does a lot of this with Stalin in his Anatomy of Human Destruction. But again, the essay that I keep referencing about the economic problem of masochism is, of course, that the fact that the drive for Freud has this economic tendency that goes even beyond the sadistic drive, because it can never fully create the final sadistic act to maintain homeostasis. Right. So it will then revert to a sadistic or not a sadistic, a masochistic one, which aligns to the original Freudian thing of nirvana principle, right?
And
This,
repetition compulsion. Yeah, as built
and
into it.
repetition.
Yeah,
Yeah, repetition
right.
compulsion.
Which is bound up with the pathological subject's submersion back into nature, right?
Right. And so like the pathological
which is a very obvious linkage in a very simple sense to the sort of post-identity status of the libertine, right? Like their
Mhm,
identity is
mhm.
sort of dissolved, right? It's like they're like subsumed back into the electric body of the body politic or something like that, right? It's a very, in some sense, it's a very like Walt Whitman kind of conception in a certain way. You could read it that way,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Which would make sense too, because that's really, again, what the manifesto of De Sade is kind of about, like a new harmony for the body politic or something like that.
Mhm. And not only is
Um,
jouissance Lacan about the body, but also when it comes to little a, the drive itself is always circulating around um, object A, right?
yeah, it's like a certain solution to the antagonism, the constitutive antagonism of the death drive, maybe.
Mhm.
Luis.
So the question of the death drive, right, is in the sense that it is the death drive is not completely detached from the pleasure principle, right? Because I mean, if you were to be saying that they're completely opposite, right, then the pleasure principle is the principle of conservation, and the death drive is the drive for death. So you will only reach it when you die. No, right? It's not in that sense. That's why the sadist doesn't seek to kill the victim. That's why we need the fantasy. The fantasy is in the sense that you prolong the pain of the victim, because the only way to prolong pleasure, jouissance, is in pain, right? In the eternality of maintaining this pain, right? So in that sense, we have the death drive in the fantasy of keeping, punishing the subject, right? In the same way that Kant postulates the immortality of the soul, in the sense that you can never be sure if you are completely holy, right? You always need to be punished by this guilt, right? So yeah, that's a dead drive there. I have the graphs. I don't know if they will explain much. If you want to see them,
Sure, please. Yeah, let's get a visual. Why not?
yeah. Let me share
That's
my
great.
screen then.
I guess, yeah, the thing is the death drive is a sort of latent presence in these oscillations. Oh yeah, sorry. Allow, yeah. Okay, you should be good now. It's not like it's locatable in a moment, but it's sort of something that animates the entire movement. Okay.
Can you see?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the book, right? And so here, can you see my cursor?
We can.
Okay, perfect. So this is the L schema, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it goes from subject to the other, right? And then this other goes back to the imaginary, the ego, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the ego goes to the other, then the unconscious, right? So this is how Lacan understands or formulates in his first seminars, right? And what is interesting here, of course, and this is what Ferencz establishes, is that the line here is the statement, imaginary statement, right? Because this is like the mirror, right? So this is the statement. So in the case that you need to go through language, right? And there is no complete line here, right? You have to go this way. You cannot go directly from your subject to your unconscious, right? There needs to be a mediation through language, right? So that's why we have this line here and not the line going this way, right? So that's the enunciation line. So this is the subject that enunciator speaks, right? And nonetheless, when this subject speaks, there is, some unconscious ideas, right? So then we have this shift here, right? Wait, let me move this stuff. Okay, so yeah, there's already shift, right? So now we have this, the other is belong to this side, right? Which then is the object A, right? So what was other in the mirror now is the voice, right? So then that's why we have the voice going up to the, now let's see here, yeah. So the voice going up to the wheel, right? So this is unconscious, right? And the will is then this line goes is a statement, right? And this statement that usually
I
in
see.
Kant is done to yourself, right?
I see.
You should not lie, right? Here is much more evident because it's given to the other, right?
Yeah.
I want to fuck you, right? This goes directly to the other, right? So the other becomes a subject, subjectivized to the will of the other, right?
Mhm.
And this then produces but this is just the subject in the divided subject, right? But then it's not the body of the victim, right? And then produces oh my God, this thing. Okay, it produces the pathological subject, right?
Yeah.
Which in Kant will be the same, right? It will be the subject of the enunciation because is the one that speaks is a pathological subject nonetheless, right? And that's the paradox, I think. And so here the desire is always on this side because I think this is the side of the unconscious on the side of the subject that enunciates, right? So I think that's why the desire, the D, is always on this side. And this therefore what at the beginning, right? In this L schema, we'll have like the usual divided subject desiring the object A, right? Now, because of this shift, is inverse, right? Because now the other is in this side. So that's why we have object A desiring, or the subject is desired by the object A, right? So it's inverse, right? Yeah, well, then we have
Actually,
the,
would you go back to it?
yeah, sure.
Yeah. There. Yes. Okay. Got it. That is essential. So the division is a point whereby the statement which is imposed by the sadist onto the one who's undergoing this operation, let's call it, divides them, but they retain enunciation, which has the effect of hardening positions. It says
No.
upside down. The tormentor's words also imply its other, that is the victim, the barred subject, and its subject effect, capital S. If the agent of torment insists in his speech at the same time as he freezes it, so far as to reduce it to the pure instrument of torment, he also places the other, the victim, in a position from which he expects a response. The structure of speech is that the subject receives his message from the other in an inverted form. He addresses a message to her with the aim of his own message, that his own message will be sent back to him with the extension that entails the articulation of the four places. This is extremely helpful.
Yeah, so
filling in. It would be nice if Lacan would do this work to elucidate things, wouldn't it?
no,
Yeah.
he's too much of a sadist. He wouldn't do that.
I know, exactly.
Yeah, and here I found interesting. I was just reading. So this is the second graph, right?
Yeah.
And here Firenze says that I will just read it. In the first schema, which stands for a particular sadian scene, it is the brute subject of pleasure, the pathological subject, which is produced at the end of the sing-sag.
Yeah.
And this subject counts as a universal. We go from the particular A to the universal S.
But by the way, yeah, the production of the Kantian final subject is anything but pathological. The whole operation is in fact done to remove their relationship to pathological empirical impurities, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
anyway, sorry, go ahead. It's inverted from that. Yeah.
And yeah, and then it says, this indeed is how universality is produced or synthetic.
Yeah.
In the second schema, which stands to a universal theory presented through Sade's work and life, it is the brute subject characteristic of the pathological which is produced, and it is incarnated in the particulars who play the part of heroes, or in the particular reader of Sade's work. Here's interesting,
Yeah.
right? Here it is the analysis of certain universality which produce particular effects, for example, on the reader. So as right now when reading Sade, we feel this what Sade tried to universalize or his mark, let's put it in that way, right? So he wanted to leave a mark nonetheless, right? And we feel it in his work, right, when we read it. Or when, in the case of the sister-in-law, they felt the mark of Sade, right? So we as reader or acquaintance of Sade felt, his presence or his mark, right?
Yeah, that's the same thing that the Buddha gives. Like it's like an object that they give, right? I mean, it would be interesting, apropos Adorno and Horkheimer, to say that Nietzsche also gives an A to the reader. I would like to see that too. It's true though. I mean, they are right. I think to read Nietzsche with Sade is essential. This is extremely illuminating to share this. Elizabeth, please.
Seriously, how is my mic? Is it okay?
Oh, we can hear you well.
Okay. So this is a question that the intonation might get a little lost as I try to think it out. But so does this mean that the point of enunciation is that which allows us to kind of unearth the hidden object of the Kantian maxim? So like the returning to what we read last time, the like, I have the right to enjoyment over your body, anyone can say to me, like, is Lacan saying that Sade introduces like the point of enunciation is that which allows us to like reanimate or repopulate this like remainder that Kant left out?
That's a good question. It's how would you say? I mean, the point of enunciation, as we just saw. In fact, Luis, if you don't mind continuing to share those, because I feel like we're not quite done with them. If it's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well,
So
let's see. So if it's the division of the subject is between statement and enunciation, where is universality to be located in Kant versus Sade? And my thought, I could be wrong, is that universality would be in the statement of the subject, whereas universality is in the enunciation as is portrayed here in the pathological subject. Luis, how would you answer this question?
well, at the beginning of the text, right, we have these when he talks about Kant, and let me see, where is it? Okay, so in 647, right? So I have been writing about this. So he says, let us consider the paradox. That is at the very moment at which the subject no longer has any object before him, that he encounters a law that no other phenomenon than something that is already signifying. The latter is obtained from a voice in conscious, which is articulated in the form of a maxim in conscious, proposes the order of pure practical reason or will there. So, and then he goes questioning about the depositor, right? So why he mentions that is because then I made a connection to where it was. So then he talks about how Kant doesn't have this object, right? Because for Kant, instead of Rousseau, right? For Rousseau, you have the voice of conscience, you have feelings, right? And then that can move someone to act morally. But for Kant, no, you need to base or ground ethics on reason, right?
Yes.
Therefore, it cannot be based on an inner voice. But
Right.
although he has two passages in the Critique of Practical Reason when he mentions the voice of reason, and this is what Lacan says, that nonetheless this object slips through the critique. And then it's very interesting because in those passages he mentions how if there is someone who wants to make happiness the ground of their will, they will found in the voice of reason, their judgment. They will felt guilty, right? And it's quite interesting because, of course, this is not what Kant will agree with, right? So nonetheless, there is this tension about the voice. And then in other works of Kant, in the Metaphysic of Morals, in Post Optimus too, there is much, he comes back to this idea of conscious, right? And so the idea is this tension, right? Because in psychoanalysis, right, the superego comes from this inner feelings, the voice of conscience, right? It's not the will of the categorical imperative as Kant understands it, right? It is a voice within you that makes you feel guilty, right? Even if you don't will it, right? So that's the interesting stuff here. So with that in mind, right, it is what is enunciated, right? Inside becomes more clear or more evident, right? Because it is in the phenomena someone is speaking and not just something within yourself that is kind of hidden, right? As Kant himself wants to hide this conscious, right? He wants to make everything based only on reason, right? On the other hand, when the sadist enunciates the law or the maxim, right? Then we have we of course we can see that there is a desire behind this maxim, right? And that's what is interesting about the voice and the subject of enunciation, right? Of there can never be, and this is why when Lacan talks about the depositor, right? And this is how Lacan understands that Kant wants to destroy wants to hide the division between enunciation and statement, because he says to have a depositor worthy of the task, right? That means that the one that enunciates the maxim needs to be completely loyal to the statement, right? And of course, that's nonsense, right? I can say I need to save that person. Doesn't mean that I really am faithful to that statement, right? So yeah. So that's the division between the two that is evident when in speech, right, and not just hidden within internal. Not really enunciations, but yeah, we can say this enunciation nonetheless, right? But it's much more hidden for Kant.
Yeah, it's interesting also that the function of the will is instantiated in an other, whereas for Kant, reason, the repetition of maximizing universal reason, this transcendental deduction itself strengthens the will. But I don't think that the will necessarily needs to be thought as instantiated in a body and some physicality or something like that. And you can see that on 648, I have the right to enjoy your body. And then the second part, and I will exercise this right without limit, kind of describes the two-part movement that we see in these two schemas, right? It's becoming a lot more clear to me now. I don't know, Elizabeth, if it's or others are others puzzled.
That was hugely helpful. I just want to say.
Yeah, Luis, that's extremely helpful.
Amazing.
How is your paper going, by the way, Luis? Is this the Trump one still?
No. This is a real academic one.
Oh, a real,
Uh,
okay.
Yeah. I will present it with my feedback group. I wanted to mention also that Alenka Chupankix mentions that, well, of course, for Kant, it is the immortality of the soul, the one that, with the postulates of the immortality of the soul, right? And with Lacan, she claims that, on the contrary, it must be the immortality of the body, right? And this is
Right.
I think what makes the S the universal, right? Because the body needs to be immortalized. The dead drive needs to maintain the tension between between keeping alive and keeping the pain, right? Sustaining the pain, right?
Which kind of goes back to that conundrum about the Poland as an ideal and the Poles and this kind of thing that can't be accounted for in Kant, which is like the empirical, the pathological subject, I suppose, has no place in. It's meant to be exterminated or excluded from the whole operation, certain way.
The one about Paul is very interesting, right? Because he mentions that and this is something that I don't know if many people have commented, but that he talks about the faithfulness of the Poles, right? So
Yeah.
what is not included is the fact that the Poles, when they say "Long live Poland," are very faithful to this statement, right? And this is what Lacan doesn't, or Kant doesn't see too much, right? That there can be a statement, and then you need to add the faithfulness to that statement, right? And the Poles are very faithful to Poland, so therefore, even though it is an analytic statement, right, it has this faithfulness that Kant wouldn't that easily include, right? And that's for why later, when he then mentions the Long Live Poland, in page 650, right? He says the moral law the moral law has no other principle, yet it makes me blame them for otherwise it lends itself to the mystification we see in this gag, Long Live Poland, right? Yeah, so this is coming from the voice of the other.
I think
So
this is very interesting because this whole idea hinges on the idea also that Kantian ethics is inadequate because it's like too subjectivist. That's why he keeps on saying that de Sade has a synthetic option that Kant lacks, meaning that he can insert an operation of a side of the other into the whole operation, which Kant doesn't seem able to do, which kind of builds off of Luis's point that the whole thing for Kant is almost like based on some interior soul or interior operation, which makes sense also for the general Marxist criticism of Kantian ethics as an expression of bourgeois individualism. It's kind of relatable.
yeah, I mean, Kant was very fond of mysticism at the beginning of his work, and there's some speculations that it's because of he was so inclined to this mysticism that he wrote the first critique to get free from this mysticism, right? Like he was very inclined to the Christianity that he had to create a whole system to criticize, his own madness, right?
Yeah, I love that. Mm-hmm.
Which then, of course, returns later, right? Because then the late Kant is much more inclined to mysticism and all that. Not mysticism, at least the idea of God, right? That he rejected in the first critique.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should get back to the text. This has been a very helpful. I'm happy with you leaving that there, but it's up to you. I just feel like that's like my warm blanket for trying to work through this madness, but it's up to you. Maybe later you can bring it back. Matan, are you okay to go?
Yeah. Desires here are the only things that bind them, and they are exalted in making it clear that desire is the other's desire. If you have read my work up to this point, you know that, more accurately stated, desire is propped up by a fantasy, at least one foot of which is in the other, and precisely the one that counts even and above all, if it happens to limp. The object, as I've shown in Freudian experience, the object of desire, where we see it in its nakedness, is but the slag of a fantasy in which the subject does not come to after blacking out. It is a case of necrophilia. The object generally vacillates in a manner that is complementary to the subject's vacillation. This is what makes it as ungraspable as is the object of the law, according to Kant. But here we suspect that a rapprochement is necessary. Doesn't the moral law represent desire in the case in which it is no longer the subject, but rather the object that is missing? So, okay. Doesn't the subject, alone remaining present in the form of the voice within, speaking nonsensically most of the time, seem to be adequately signified by the bar with which the signifier S bastardizes him, that signifier being released from the fantasy from which it dérivait, in the two senses of the term in which it both derives and drifts from. Although this symbol returns the commandment from within, at which Kant marvels, to its rightful place, it opens our eyes to the encounter which, from law to desire, goes further than the slipping away of their object for both the law and desire. It is the encounter in which the ambiguity of the word freedom plays a part. The moralist, by grabbing freedom for himself, always strikes me as more impudent still than imprudent. And I take that to mean that the moralist can still be authentic. And that has some structural significance. But let us listen to Kant himself illustrated once more. Suppose someone alleges that his lustful inclination is quite irresistible to him when he encounters the favored object and the opportunity. Ask him whether, if in front of the house where he finds this opportunity, a gallows were erected on which he would be strung up immediately after gratifying his lust, he would not then conquer his inclination. One does not have to guess long what he would reply, but ask him whether, if his prince demanded, on the threat of the same prompt penalty of death, that he give false testimony against an honest man, whom the prince would like to ruin under specious pretenses, he might consider it possible to overcome his love of life, however great it might be. He will perhaps not venture to assure us whether or not he would overcome that love, but he must concede without hesitation that doing so would be possible for him. He judges, therefore, that he can do something because he is conscious that he ought to do it, and he cognizes freedom within himself, the freedom with which otherwise, without the moral law, he would have remained unacquainted. So we have the voice within, on one hand, telling you to do something naughty, dirty, whatever, and on the same hand, or in the same example, being the same voice which refuses instrumentalization at the hands of like an authority.
Yep.
But I guess the same pathology remains this, and it seems like with the whole rotation thing, it has more to do with orienting oneself around naivete than shall we say, like subjectively addressing the pathology. The first response that is presumed to be given here by a subject, about whom we are first told that a great deal transpires by means of words, gives me the impression that we are not being given the letter of what he said. We should not take them at face value when that is the crux of the matter. For the fact is that, in order to express it, Kant prefers to rely on someone whose sense of shame we would, in any case, risk offending. For in no case would he stoop so low, namely, the ideal bourgeois to whom Kant elsewhere declares that he takes his hat off, no doubt in order to counter Fontenelle, the overly gallant centenary. We will excuse the hoodlum then for having to testify under oath, but it is possible that a partisan of passion who would be blind enough to combine it with questions of honor would make trouble for Kant by forcing him to recognize that no occasion precipitates certain people more surely toward their goal than the one that involves defiance of or even contempt for the gallows. For the gallows is not the law, nor can the gallows be wheeled in by the law here. Only the police have the necessary trucks, and while the police can be the state, as Hegel says, the law is something else, as we have known since antiquity. I think this is kind of worth mulling over for a second, because in Kant's example here, he's talking about, well, the guy's so horny normally that the gallows would not present an obstacle, but in response to which Lacan is saying, no, the gallows potentially are the necessary and sufficient condition for the pathology to insist upon itself. And I see a hand up from Akshay, please.
I mean, I wanted to agree with the sentiment in so much as I thought this passage and the next couple of passages down to the bottom of this page and the first one at the top, like it's like, you know, it seems to be less about sadism than a sort of like moralism in Sade. Like, you know, why write these books? Why go to prison? Like, if not like through a desire to sort of like confront the gallows, which is sort of like stands in for a sort of like sad sort of, you know, having a meeting with the destiny of his own desire, right? Like, yeah. So I mean, I don't know. That's what I yeah. I leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's the point of Lacan, right? Because for Kant, the moral law is irresistible, right? And of course, the moral law is not based on desire. So it's inaudible for Kant to believe that there could be someone who will risk their life just for fulfilling some naughty desire, right? When in fact, Sade is a great example of someone who will in fact risk their life to fulfill their desire, right?
And you know, earlier when he said that this would give like the virtue to the more mundane parts of life, that's what I see. There's constantly something being like there's always this condition not being met, and there's a nod to it not being met in the normal functioning of the law. By this condition, I mean like something like an ultimate gallows-like figure, which would inspire a lawful perversion, or a lawful, like almost like a Russell's paradox response to the historical question of law.
I mean, I would just add that if someone else wants to go, please do. But I mean, like with death, I guess there's the association of like this Heideggerian sort of like being towards death, and like death is the reckoning of a certain kind of like ethical responsibility. You know, like of I don't know, sort of finitude of existence as like a reckoning. I don't know. I mean, and this like I found that particular line like the law is something else. Like it's like very kind of rich and resonant, but like in the sense that I think like I don't know, there is some kind of I don't know. I mean, I'm not as schooled in Antigone's and stuff, so I'm not sure what others think.
I was thinking that the first element indicates that the Kantian theory of the subject will not be divided over the problem of pleasure or the problem of desire, but only over the insertion of something which violates like a universal in in this case a violation that is purely elevated to something which the subject cannot deny as a contradiction within the moral law. But the contradiction within pleasure is non-intersubjective, you could say. It doesn't, Kant doesn't, which would make sense because that's the meaning of then the bourgeois question of shame, because the Kantian position on sex, desire, is pathological itself, and therefore is like forecloses the question of the other in a way. It's like, which would make perfect sense to situate Kant historically as like a sexual Puritan, and you know what I mean? Like he's thinking sex almost like very like as a monad, like, you know what I'm saying? There's not any experimentation allowed. It's like missionary style all the way. Which is why it like doesn't riddle the subject. And
You know
I
what
find
this is
I find
about?
it interesting though. I do find it interesting that my own inclination is to agree with Kant in this formulation. Whereas when I read intuitively de Sade, my inclination is not to. I must confess my religious whatever baggage, perhaps.
Right. And
Go
sorry,
ahead.
sorry to I'm one other person talking over Matilda. Sorry about that. I think with Sade, it's almost there's something like it's more comes in the form of like our identification with, you know, his fanciful writing. It's very like prodigious in terms of its ability. And another figure that I've been reading about recently, which the French surrealist, which Lacan hung out with earlier in his career, dealt with a lot, was this guy called like Isidore Ducasse. He had this book called Les Chants de Mal d'Aurore. I would really recommend reading maybe like a chapter from it or something if anyone wants, because it's very good writing in the sense that he's on one end fully identifying with like the pathological subject we're reading here, while also turning it into like a technique that is communicable and has an effect on us, despite the seeming meaning of this lesson being that this is a task that will necessarily lead in failure.
Right, which is interesting because in a way, you know, the problem with the Kantian subject is shame. I mean, why does Lacan say shame? Like, why does shame enter as the problem of ethics, like the center of ethics, which goes unaddressed by Kant in a certain way? I find that very compelling. And like a huge blind spot, perhaps you could say. Although it reminds me of a professor I had when I was doing my master's who was a Kantian, and I'd have to pull up my notes. But I believe that she wrote on the topic of Kant and shame. She didn't have any knowledge of Lacan at all. So that's actually something I'll look into and share in the Discord. Go ahead, Matilda. Sorry to keep you waiting.
I just wanted to say that it seems like the like a kind of brute example of like facing the gallows, like doesn't bring shame into the picture. I guess like you just flee from the, well, you wouldn't worry about your lust if you're faced with death, and there's not really like a choice proposed, I guess. And then the second one, there's like some sort of choice that you encounter, and it forces you to cognize your freedom.
Isn't it that the other? Isn't it that the other is engaged in the second movement, whereas the other's not in the first? But then that's like, but like the other is, but not thought. If that makes sense.
You have a good point about the other. I'm just wondering about like the paragraph where he's talking about for the gallows is not the law.
Right.
And so like, I guess the law is what you encounter that makes you cognize your freedom.
Right.
Whether or not you can act up to it or not. So I don't know. It seems like, at least with, and then like, perhaps you might disobey the Lord. You know, it kind of leads you into this like abyss of like, oh, maybe I would like die. I suppose, I don't know. And
I think the question is of like a living death and what the gallows represents in terms of ridding oneself of that.
it seems like the gallows aren't sufficient to make you cognize the law or cognize your freedom. And then once you, whatever is going on with the second example, however it's framed, makes it that you like cognize, you're able to cognize your freedom and perhaps go into death. Whereas like death posed by the gallows was like something you flee from like naturally, whereas like you could go towards your death in the second example. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yep. No, 100%. This is like this crazy fucking narrative structure of Paul Claudel's heroine in his trilogy of plays becomes a figure who faces the second death just as Antigone does, but does so in a way that elevates an element of her decision which has more bearing on the modern condition of humanity. And this is famously why Lacan will say that Paul Claudel has given us an update to Sophocles for the modern period, which is why Alenka Zupančič in her book on ethics of the real spends all of this time on Singe de Coufortain is her name. She's this very interesting figure. I don't think, unfortunately, that she's been portrayed in any movies or films, just in these plays, if I'm not mistaken. And only like Lacanians talk about this figure. But she is the figure that a lot of Lacanians will see as like the linchpin of the height of the meaning of ethical decisions. Maybe we can talk about that figure in a future session. It would be cool to have a presentation just on Claudel, just as an FYI, or maybe a future thing we could do. I love this passage from Kant, though, because now we're finally understanding, like, okay, this figure Kant is not a total fool. Like, you can see his system is deeply compelling. I don't know if others feel that way too. Like,
In
it
which
totally
way?
makes sense. Do you
In
agree,
which way?
Matan?
You know, I think on one end, yes, but on the other hand, as soon as I kind of like think about my own life and the way, I don't know, especially like gadgets and machines provide answers for us today,
Yeah.
and like what Kant promises in terms of like a machine that will not necessarily tell you the moral law, but will allow you to like bracket it based off like the consequences of what happens.
Okay.
I think like when we see the Democrats, when they have all these like stats focused initiatives or whatever, they always get their own prejudices reflected back at them. And I think that's sort of the message being put here. It has more to do with not the inner workings of like this system, but rather the fact that it has to be like mediated through displays. And here I do think we need to talk more about like materialism, or maybe try to get into like figure out a way to integrate like CMC and like the universal equivalent into this if there's a way to kind of alter things in that diagram in the same way that we're doing here with
Because
consideration to the division of A into A and A prime.
the other problem, of course,
Yeah.
is that in order for the efficacy of the moral law to become actualized, it necessitates a non-barred subject to catalyze it, right? It requires the heroic individual, or the authentic. Maybe it's a problem of authenticity, which is interesting because that would be like the S non-barred, maybe. So, right, the honest man, right?
But I think what we're missing so far is that, I don't know if we already read it, but when here Lacan talks about that law and repressed desire are the same thing, right? And
Yep.
this is the issue here with Kant, right?
That is Kant with Sade right there, baby. That is
Yeah,
the two.
because
Yeah.
Because the maximum here in I guess is Latin, right? I just translated, right? Is
Right.
about keeping your life, right? So because I think what Lacan is showing that in this case, right, someone that will prefer his life instead of risking it, right, is not actually following the categorical imperative, or
Right.
is following a very strange categorical imperative, because if you see this maximum, the one in Latin, as a categorical imperative, is one that doesn't risk your life, but will be risking your desire, right? And
There's
or
the
repressing desire.
there's the other problem, which you broach in ethics classes in a fairly banal or annoying way, which is that one has to make an imminent judgment on the subject authenticity, meaning like, oh yeah, well, we can apply this universal maxim, but not to the Palestinians, because they don't stand in for the universal, right? That becomes a huge problem in Kant, right? What's the basis by which we're making that determination on the status of the subject's complicity with the moral
Yeah.
law?
Oh, I can also imagine like, oh, we will really include it, but for rhetorical purposes, we will say so and so. But we all know, that obligates you to further, I don't know, political alliances that you'll have to do things that you're further and further like less comfortable with, and you're going to keep shifting your frame more and more. And well, yeah.
But also the fact that there's a disavowal about the authority, so that the state representatives of the authority are not the vessels of the moral law. And that is, you can cue Adorno's commentary on Nuremberg and the Nazi Kantian thing and Hannah Arendt and all of that shit. Anyways, we should go back to the text.
And I think also it has to do with what is repressed particularly, right? Because in a way, I mean, if you think it's in a psychoanalytic way, right, the Kantian subject, of course, follows the imperatives, but some particular imperatives, right, of a particular father, right? Right. So there is always, of course, the tension of policing the other, right? With this categorical imperative that for Kant, of course, are mystified with the idea of reason, right? That Kant will say, okay, but yeah, my imperatives are just myself stating them, right? Using reason alone, right? And he doesn't see the unconscious aspect from where they come from, right? In which psychoanalysis, of course, will introduce the internalization of the paternal figure there, right? So yeah, you're yourself creating those imperatives, but they are unconsciously produced, right? That's why he means like when Lacan talks about an already signifying, phenomenon, right? Yeah, you claim to be the one that is enunciating the imperatives, but nonetheless, it comes from the other, right?
But my question to that is, well, at what level of like structure are we talking about? Can we then say that the structure of like irritability in nerves and an individual psychology can then be mapped onto something like a state, which maybe, I don't know, produces memory differently?
I don't think so. I don't think it could in the Kantian thing. That's already too caught in the pathological body and but I think for purpose of time, we should forge ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I did also happen to talk over another person, Akshay.
Oh yes, Akshay, yeah, please go ahead.
No, let's keep moving on.
Okay, sure thing. So I'll continue. For the gallows is not the law, nor can the gallows be wheeled in by the law here. Only the police have the necessary trucks, and while the police can be the state, as Hegel says, the law is something else, as we have known since Antigone. Kant, besides, does not contradict this with his apology. The gallows is brought in here merely so that he can attach to it, along with the subject, his love of life. Now, this is what the desire in the maxim et non propter vitam vivendi perdere cosas can become in a moral being, rising, precisely because he is moral, to the rank of a categorical imperative, assuming he has his back to the wall, which is precisely where he is forced here. Desire, what is called desire, suffices to make life meaningless if it turns someone into a coward. And when law is truly present, desire does not stand up, but that is because law and repressed desire are one and the same thing, which is precisely what Freud discovered. We are ahead at halftime, Professor. Let us chalk up our success to the infantry, the key to the game, as we know. For we have not brought in either our knight, which would have been easy since it would be Sade, whom we believe to be qualified enough here, our bishop, our rook, human rights, freedom of thought, your body is your property, etc., or your queen, an appropriate figure with which to designate the daring deeds of courtly love. This would have involved moving too many people for a less certain result. For if I claim that for a few bantering remarks, Sade risked, knowing full well what he was doing, consider what he did with his outings, whether licit or illicit. If Sade risked in seemingly, in bantering remarks, if he risked imprisonment in the Bastille for a third of his lifetime, it was rather well-aimed banter, no doubt, but all the more demonstrative with respect to its recompense. I'll have Pinel and his Penelopes taking aim at me. Moral madness, the latter opine. In any case, a fine affair it is. I am reminded to show respect for Pinel, to whom we owe one of the noblest steps of humanity. 13 years in Charenton for Sade were, however, part of this step, I retort. But he should not have been sent there, I am told. That's the whole point, I continue. It was Pinel's step that led him there. His place, and all thinkers agree on this point, was elsewhere. But there you have it. Those who think clearly think that his place was outside, and the right thinking, starting with Royer Collard, who demanded it at the time, wanted him condemned to hard labor, if not to a hanging. This is precisely why Pinel was an important moment in the history of thought. Willy-nilly, he supported the destruction, on the right and the left, by thought of freedoms that the revolution had just promulgated in the very name of the activity of thought. For if we consider human rights from the vantage point of philosophy, we see what, in any case, everyone now knows about their truth. They boil down to the freedom to desire in vain. A lot of good that does us, beye jambe. But it gives us an opportunity to recognize in it the impulsive, de prima so freedom we saw earlier, and to confirm that it is clearly the freedom to die. But it also gives us the opportunity to be frowned upon by those who find in it low nutritional value. They are plentiful in our time. We see here the renewed conflict between needs and desires in which, as if by chance, it is the law that empties the shell. To counter Kant's apologue, courtly love offers us a no less tempting path, but it requires us to be erudite, to be well-read, to be erudite by one's, literary comprehension, yeah. To be erudite by one's position is to bring on the attack of the erudites, and in this field that is tantamount to the entrance of the clowns. Kant could very easily make us lose our serious demeanor here already, since he hasn't the slightest sense of comedy. This is proved by what he says about it when he discusses it. But someone who has no sense of comedy whatsoever is Sade, as has been pointed out. This topic could perhaps be fatal to him, but a preface is not designed to do the author a disservice.
Okay, so all of this is helpful as we remember from the ethics seminar in the oscillations of the ethics of courtly love, and we're introduced to this question of moral law as das Ding, which I feel is it's a prelude to all of this. When was this text published in relationship to when the ethics seminar was delivered? Does anybody know?
So this text is written between seminar 9 and seminar 10.
Okay, so this written like 2 years after?
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
I might be mistaken, but there's also some interesting circumstances. I don't know if you mentioned this about its publication. It was initially supposed to be a preface or something for a collection of de Sade's work that was never included in the actual volume.
Right. Because the reason that he's saying this thing about it's like it would take us too much time to plot the woman. It's because, remember, the das Ding of the woman in courtly love stands for like noumenal, the unknowable thing, right? And that then becomes kind of like where Kant enters into Lacanian ethics as such. So Kant then is like rehabilitated, or he's deployed in a different way than he is in this text, by the way. What do you guys make of Pinel, the moral psychiatrist figure? Anything to say about him? I don't know his relationship to de Sade, but there must be something there. But I'm not sure what it is.
Interesting that he talks about the qui pense vain, the right thinking, right? Because that's something that he, in the ethics at least, he mentions about thinking along the pleasure principle, right? Or thinking morally, right? Is to think like in a Foucauldian way in discourse, right? So I don't know what to make about that, right? But I think that's what he means by thinking correctly, right?
I thought he was saying that, yeah, like it's kind of like a moral panic, and right thinking is like reactionary thinking, right? Like in the sense of like it's like common sense that yes, of course, this pervert and sodomite should be jailed, but But again, like I don't think like Lacan is sort of agreeing that Sade is a sadist or any of those things, right?
Right. Yeah.
What is interesting in the court of love, right, is that, I mean, if we follow the logic so far, right, that the case of the sadist, right, there is the inversion of the fantasy, right? In court of love, we have like the object, the subject desiring the object, right? Desiring the courtly lover, right? Or not the courtly lover, but the woman, right? So we have desiring the object, right? And not the object being the cause or being the cause of the imperative, right? So it's not in that way, like an ethic is not an ethics of imperatives in a Kantian way, right? But that's why it means you need to be erudite, right? You need to, maybe in an Aristotelian way, right? I think that's what I guess, right? But it is desiring to know how to get your desired goal, right? And not just following the imperative and and sacrificing yourself.
I like
But
the Oh, please.
Go ahead.
Oh no, please insist.
Oh, I was just curious. I mean, my thought was actually that I mean, first of all, the thing that is interesting to me about the courtly love is the way that, like, I think he talks about, how Cervantes shows the disillusion of the ideal by which the foundation of courtly love was made possible as like conditioned by historical circumstances, that then in those circumstances change, that ideal can no longer sustain itself. So then like the empirical otherness of the woman would have to be revealed or something like that. And that's like the dialectic of courtly love. But isn't it also true that it is a Kantian relation because it's finding love not in desire, but in the ideal, in the noumenal idea of the woman, isn't it? In some sense, it's like that's the aim. It's aimed not at the empirical woman. Which is interesting, though. I think that again, it's interesting about like what allows for love investment to possess something like a maximum of infinity or like a efficacy or something like that. I'm a little confused though, Luis, regarding this idea of Aristotle. What did you mean by this?
I mean, like virtue ethics, right? No, I mean, virtue ethics doesn't follow a law, right? You need to find your way to how to act correctly,
I see.
right? And
I
I
see.
think that's why he also mentions the entrance of the clowns, right?
I see.
How to have a sense of humor about the superego, right? Of which neither Kant nor Sade had. That's why they were very really attached to these ethical positions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Kant really kind of demonstrates this kind of a comedic mood about it, or this humorous mood about it, in that if you guys recall the prosopopoeia from Seminar 16, it was just a excerpt from a full prosopopoeia from his The Thing in this very book, the Écrits. And in that, it begins with a scene where there's a knight. He just like
Yeah.
slept with his woman or whatever, very virtuous. I don't know, he earned a respect or whatever. But then he wakes up and he feels this like sense of disgust at looking at her body. And Lacan's entire thing is to kind of much in the same vein of how he's speaking here. He's kind of suggesting that maybe it has something to do with like this principle of segregation. So yeah, the thing, we don't know it until we know it a little bit too much, in which case the act of knowing it too much is almost like an outlet in which to, I don't know. Well, you know what? I'll stop there. I have my own theories, but I don't want to go on.
I mean, please go on.
Yeah, that's the Hamlet complex. Yeah.
Yeah, so the question then is, what does like speaking well or being like literate have to do with this?
Uh-huh.
That's
Yeah,
really
that
my
is.
question. Because to me it seems like this it's a symptom that comes at the level of like a real trauma to the subject in the sense that it's like kind of overwhelming to them. But I guess being funny is a way to kind of like on one hand it's a movement which fetishizes though, as Lacan also speaks about. So I don't know.
What do you mean?
Now we're getting into the ambiguities of the Kantian example regarding the empirical status of the subject that is dealt with. And sorry, Akshay, please.
No, I wasn't saying.
Oh, okay.
I was just asking Matan to. I mean, I was very intrigued by what you were saying, Matan. So it's kind of. I mean, I don't know. I think it has something to do with this seriousness. But sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say, you know what? I'll reread it too. The Thing, or the seminar on the Thing, or whatever. I don't know what the exact title is. It's in the exact book we're reading. It's
Right.
it's one of my favorite pieces just because of how like ridiculous he acts, but he knows he's acting that way. I don't know. Uh, does anyone have anything to say, or shall I continue?
I think we should continue.
Yeah. Let us thus turn to the second stage of Kant's apologue. It no more proves his point than the first stage. For assuming that Kant's Heletier has the slightest presence of mind, he will ask Kant if perchance it would be his duty to bear true witness, were this the means by which the tyrant could satisfy his desire. Should he say that the innocent man is a Jew, for example, if he truly is one, before a tribunal, we have seen such situations, that considers this a punishable offense, or that he is an atheist when it is quite possible that he himself has a better grasp on the import of the accusation than a consistory that simply wants to establish a file. And in the case of some deviation from the party line, will he plead that this deviation is not guilty at a time and a place where the name of the game is autocritique? Why wouldn't he? After all, is an innocent man ever completely spotless? Will he say what he knows? We could make the maxim that one must counter a tyrant's desire into a duty if a tyrant is someone who appropriates the power to enslave the other's desire. Thus, with regard to the two examples and the precarious mediation between them that Kant uses as a lever to show that the law weighs in the scales not only pleasure, but also pain, happiness, and even the burden of abject poverty, not to mention the love of life, in short, everything pathological, it turns out the desire can have not only the same success, but can obtain it more legitimately. But if the credence we lent the critique due to the alacrity of its argumentation owed something to our desire to know where it was heading, can't the ambiguity of this success turn the movement back toward a revising of the concessions we unwittingly made? For example, the disgrace that rather quickly befell all objects that were proposed as goods because they were incapable of achieving a harmony of wills, simply because they introduce competition. Such was the case of Milan, about which both Charles V and Francois I knew what it cost them for each to see the same good in it. For that is clearly to misrecognize the status of the object of desire. I can introduce its status here only by reminding you what I teach about desire, which must be formulated as the other's desire, since it is originally desire for what the other desires. This is what makes the harmony of desires conceivable, but not devoid of danger. For when desires line up in a chain that resembles the procession of Bruegel's blind men, each one, no doubt, has his hand in the hand of the one in front of him, but no one knows where they are all going. Now, in retracing their steps, they all clearly experience a universal rule, but this is because they do not know any more about it. Would the solution in keeping with practical reason be that they go around in circles? Even when lacking, the gaze is clearly the object that presents each desire with its universal rule by materializing its cause and binding to it the subject's division between center and absence. Let us therefore confine ourselves to saying that a practice like psychoanalysis, which takes desire as the subject's truth, cannot misrecognize what follows without demonstrating what it represses. In psychoanalysis, displeasure is understood to provide a pretext for repressing desire. Displeasure arising as it does along the pathway of desire's satisfaction. But displeasure is also understood to provide the very form this satisfaction takes in the return of the repressed. So almost like in an unwilling enjoyment, an axiomatic enjoyment that one has in segregating, essentially. Similarly, pleasure redoubles its aversion when it recognizes the law by supporting the desire to comply with it that constitutes defense. If happiness means that the subject finds uninterrupted pleasure in his life, as the Critique of Practical Reason defines it quite classically, it is clear that happiness is denied to whoever does not renounce the pathway of desire.
That's helpful. Now we can see why Kant is like a true break in the history of ethics from Aristotle, and also why Aristotle requires more erudition, because the path of happiness is the one that, on the one hand, more thinkers have followed. So there's like a richer literature on Aristotle's conception of ethics in relationship to the good, which, by the way, this whole point about the reference to the two figures in Milan, I believe that's a reference to this point that he's made in Seminar 16 about the introduction of the absolutization of the market at that moment in Italy in the 1400s or something like this, because he's talking about objects and investment of pleasure in them. But I don't know that there's a footnote, so I can't be positive that that's. I'd have to track down that. That's a speculative point. But anyways, all of this is a nice recapitulation of schema 1, by the way, if you notice. The way that he's portraying all of this in a certain way. I mean, yes, he's getting to some of these general platitudes and maxims, which we sort of already tend to know as material claims about psychoanalysis writ large. So I'm not having too hard of a time following all of those. I don't know if others are.
In that case, I'll continue.
Yeah, continue, please.
Yeah.
Uh,
Please.
I mean, because then you will say that the crucial aspect and I would like to stop then, because they say this renunciation can be will, but at the cost of man's truth, right? So I think that's crucial, right? And that's what defines Kantian ethics, right? That what is repressed in this desire is the truth, and that we can then see it maybe in the master discourse, right? How truth is being repressed, and precisely as the divided subject, right? And yeah, so there is, of course, repression at the cost of man's truth, right? And this is something that, of course, in the case of Sade, he disavows, right? He disavows repression, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, because it would make sense, because in the master's discourse there, you have the at that level of the repressed truth, which is the subject, the formula for fantasy, which sort of acts as the sort of condition for desire, right? Because it's connected with the object cause, or at least not connected necessarily. There's a lozenge, of course. But I was also thinking too, it's interesting how you juxtapose, Daniel, like the difference between Kant and Lacan saying and Aristotle, because with like Aristotle and virtue ethics, it's eudaimonia, but there's also the aim, right?
There's also the fact that he continuously chastises Aristotelian ethics as inadequate because it does not have an antagonistic theory of happiness.
Right, exactly. And man always
yeah.
aims at the good, right? For him.
No. It's like exactly. Like the good is not split, but in reality, That's what is missing in Aristotelian
Mhm.
eudaimonia, is that the way that pleasure is always divided within the subject. And yeah,
Mhm.
so
But
but
that's
but
that's what I was
actually
getting at.
there's also points at which he does suggest that Aristotle does see that division. It's somewhat of a mixed historical record in a certain way, because he also quotes, I think, a lot of Catholic philosophers who do seem to understand that idea or something like that, which is like, related to this point that like Pascal invents the object A, for example.
Mhm.
Does anybody know the reference to Charles and Francois the First in Milan? Because he says they introduce competition. Matilda, do you have a thought on that?
I was reading that passage as like um, the objects that we desire. Well, I don't really have a gloss, but it was something along the lines of like, maybe not much deeper than like, we can fight over certain objects, but so like Kant, in a certain sense, perhaps like wants a harmonization of all the wills, but I don't know. I have nothing intelligent to
I think this is from the second critique.
It's a reference to a war between Spain and France that was born from I don't know, some type of well, ultimately kind of like a rivalry, apparently. I don't know. It's an obscure reference, maybe not the best reference, but go ahead.
I'm not sure this is from the critique that we read last time about the two brothers wanted the same thing. I'm not sure if these are the same people. Because in Kant, in the second critique, claims that you cannot you cannot ground virtue in empirical sensibility, because then you will say, okay, then two brothers can desire the same thing, right? Which wouldn't make sense. And I think here he's trying to say that the object of desire is never just an empirical object, right? I think.
I see.
I don't know if
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is
yeah.
he's referring to the same. I will need to check.
They were fighting for whatever autonomy or control over Milan. So yeah, it's not exactly clear. It may also be somewhat of a similar play off of the polls and the poll. Anyways, I don't know.
Yeah, it is. It is.
You know
It
what I
is from
mean?
the second critique. That's example he makes, and
Okay, so it is related to that.
it is the same passage when he talks about the deposit, right? So it's the same question
Got it.
about the
Got
deposit
it.
and depositor, right?
Got it. Wow. God, this text is fucking insane. Whew. Heavy duty, huh? Okay, do you know where we're at? What's on?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Maybe you could
Now,
start if happiness means that the subject finds uninterrupted.
Pager wheel?
663.
Yes, here. If happiness means that the subject finds uninterrupted pleasure in his life, as the Critique of Practical Reason defines it quite classically, it is clear that happiness is denied to whomever does not renounce the pathway of desire. This renunciation can be willed, but at the cost of man's truth, which is quite clear from the disapproval of those who upheld the common ideal that the Epicureans and even the Stoics met with. Their ataraxia deposed their wisdom. We fail to realize that they degraded desire, and not only do we not consider the law to be commensurably exalted by them, but it is precisely because of this degrading of desire that, whether we know it or not, we sense that they cast down the law. Sade, the former aristocrat, takes up St. Just right where one should. The proposition that happiness has become a political factor is incorrect. It has always been a political factor and will bring back the scepter and the censor, then make do with it very well. Rather, it is the freedom to desire that is a new factor, not because it inspired a revolution. People have always fought and died for a desire, but because this revolution wants its struggle to be for the freedom of desire. Consequently, the revolution also wants the law to be free, so free that it must be a widow. The widow par excellence. The one that sends your head to the basket if it so much as balks regarding the matter at hand. Had St. Just's head remained full of the fantasies in Organt, Thermidor might have been a triumph for him. Were the right to jouissance recognized, it would consign the domination of the pleasure principle to an obsolete era. In enunciating this right, Sade imperceptibly displaces for each of us the ancient axis of ethics, which is but the egoism of happiness.
See, here he's just summarizing the manifesto, Onward, Frenchmen, if you would be Republicans, very, very well. And, you know, sorry, go on.
One cannot say that every reference to it is eliminated in Kant's work, given the very familiarity with which it accompanies him, and still more given the offshoots of it seen in the exigencies that make him argue both for some retribution in the hereafter and progress in this world. Should another happiness be glimpsed whose name I first uttered, the status of desire would change, demanding a re-examination of it. But it's here that something must be gauged. How far does Sade lead us in the experience of this jouissance, or simply of its truth? For the human pyramids he describes, which are fabulous insofar as they demonstrate the cascading nature of jouissance, these water buffets of desire built so that jouissance make the Ville d'Este gardens sparkle with a Baroque voluptuousness, the higher they try to make jouissance spurt up into the heavens, the more insistently the question, what is it that is flowing here, demands to be answered. Unpredictable quanta by which the love-hate atom glistens in the vicinity of the thing from which man emerges through a cry. What is experienced beyond certain limits has nothing to do with what desire is propped up by in fantasy, which is in fact constituted on the basis of these limits.
Okay, we should just pause and, you know, just marvel at the, I don't know, the sheer mastery of this little paragraph and formula. Unpredictable quanta by which the love-hate atom glistens in the vicinity of the thing from which man emerges through a cry. What is experienced beyond certain limits. You can almost like read this as you move through the L schema in a certain way. Beyond certain limits has nothing to do with what desire is propped up by in fantasy. That's like the split, which is in fact constituted on the basis of this. Yeah, okay, sorry, I'm thinking out loud but quietly. Go on, please. We know that Sade went beyond these limits in real life, otherwise he probably would not have given us the blueprint for his fantasy in his work. Perhaps I will surprise people when I call into question what his work also tries to convey of this real experience, confining our attention to the bedroom for a rather lively glimpse of a girl's feelings about her mother. The fact remains that Wickedness, so suitably situated by Sade in its transcendence, does not teach us much that is new here about the changes of her heart. A work that wishes to be bad cannot allow itself to be a bad piece of work, and one has to admit that philosophy in the bedroom leaves itself open to this ironic remark by a whole strain of good works found in it. It's a little too preachy. Okay. Sorry, please continue. Sorry for my
Oh no, you know what? My vocal
hasty
cords
interruption.
my
I
vocal
was just
cords
trying
continue
to go very slow for myself to piece together a visualization of something, because I do feel that we've already gone through the hard part of visualizing the movement of this operation. So some of this is just like a very really illustrative and like elegant way of recapitulating. That's as I'm reading it. So I don't need much other than just to like let it absorb. I don't know about others.
I feel like I'm the same, yeah, and hearing you guys talk and going through the Discord messages, the torrent of them as much as I can, that's also lots of fun.
Yeah,
We're almost done. And
we're almost
and
done. We're almost
I
done.
feel like at the end you realize like, oh wait, this was just like a preface for a book. It kind of like loses its ambition by the end of it in a sense, but we'll see. We'll see.
Oh, really? Okay, please continue.
Of course, it is a treatise on the education of girls, and it is subject as such to the laws of a genre. Despite its merit of bringing to light the anal sadism that obsessively permeated this subject for the 2 preceding centuries, it remains a treatise on education. The victim is bored to death by the preaching, and the teacher is full of himself. The historical or better erudite information here is dreary and makes us miss someone like Le Motel Levayer. The physiology contained in it is made up of wet nurses' notions, and as for what might pass for sex ed, one has the impression that one is reading a modern medical treatise on the subject, which says it all. More coherence in his scandal would help him see, in the usual impotence of educational intentions, the very impotence against which fantasy here fights, whence arises the obstacle to every valid account of the effects of education, since what brought about the results cannot be admitted to in discussing the intention. This remark would have been priceless due to the praiseworthy effects of sadistic impotence. The fact that Sade failed to make it gives us pause for thought. His failure here is confirmed by another that is no less remarkable. The work never presents us with a successful seduction in which his fantasy would nevertheless find its crowning glory, that is, a seduction in which the victim, even if she were at her last gasp, would consent to her tormentor's intention or even join his side in the fervor of her consent. This demonstrates from another vantage point that desire is the flip side of the law. In the Sadean fantasy, we see how they support each other. For Sade, one is always on the same side, the good or the bad. No wrongdoing can change that. It is thus the triumph of virtue. This paradox merely comes down to the derision characteristic of edifying books, the kind Justine aims at too much not to have adopted it. Apart from the nose that twitches, which we find at the end of the dialogue of a priest with a dying man, a posthumous work, admit that this is a subject hardly suited to other graces than divine. A lack of witticisms, and one might say more broadly of the wit, the need for which Alexander Pope had over a century before already indicated, makes itself felt at times in Sade's work. This is obviously forgotten owing to the invasion of pedantry that has weighed on French letters since World War II. But if you need a strong stomach to follow Sade when he recommends calumny, the first article of morality that he would institute in his Republic, one might prefer that he add the spice of someone like Renan. Let us be thankful, Renan writes, that Jesus encountered no law against insulting a whole class of citizens, for the Pharisees would have been inviolable. Renan continues. His exquisite mockery and magic provocations always hit home. The Nessus tunic of ridicule that the Jew, the son of the Pharisees, has been dragging in tatters behind him for 18 centuries was woven by Jesus with divine skill. A masterpiece of high-level mockery, his scathing remarks have become burned into the flesh of the hypocrite and of the falsely devout. Incomparable remarks, worthy of a son of God. Only a god knows how to kill in this fashion. Socrates and Molière merely graze the skin. Jesus carries fire and rage into the very depths of one's bones. For these remarks derive their value from the sequel that we know, I mean his vocation as an apostle from the rank of the Pharisees and the universal triumph of Pharisaic virtues. This, you will agree, lends itself to an argument that is more relevant than the rather sorry excuse that Sade is content with in his apology for calumny, namely, that an honest man will always triumph over it. This platitude does not encumber the somber beauty that radiates from this monument of challenges. This beauty evinces the experience that I am seeking behind the make-believe quality of the fantasy. It is a tragic experience insofar as it projects its condition here in a light that comes from beyond all fear and pity. Beyond bewilderment and shadows, such is the conjunction, unlike that found in jokes, that fascinates us in these scenes with its ember-like brilliance. This tragedy is of the kind that becomes clearer later on in the century in more than one work, whether erotic novel or religious drama. I would call it senile tragedy. Until I said so, no one realized, except schoolboys in their jokes, that it is but a stone's throw from noble tragedy. To see what I mean, read Claudel's trilogy, La Perrée Humiliée. To see what I mean, one should also know that I have shown that this trilogy contains the characteristics of the most authentic tragedy. It is Melpomene who, along with Clio, is decrepit, without our knowing which one will bury the other. We are now finally enjoined to examine Sade, my neighbor, the invocation of which we owe to the perspicacity of Pierre Klosowski. Being extreme, his perspicacity has no need to resort to the same things as the highbrow literati. It is undoubtedly Klosowski's discretion that makes him justify his formulation with a reference to Saint Labouré. I do not, however, feel inclined to give it the same justification. My structural reference points make it easy to grasp the Sadean fantasy is better situated among the stays of Christian ethics than elsewhere, but what must be kept in mind is that Sade himself refuses to be my neighbor, not so that I can refuse to be his neighbor in turn, but so as to recognize the meaning of his refusal here. In my view, Sade does not have neighborly enough relations with his own malice to encounter his neighbor in it, a characteristic he shares with many people and with Freud in particular. For this is indeed the only reason why beings who are sometimes experienced back away from the Christian commandment. We see what it is to my mind. The crucial test of this in Sade's rejection of the death penalty, the history of which would suffice to prove, if not its logic, at least that it is one of the correlates of charity. Sade thus stopped at the point where desire and the law become bound up with each other. If something in him let himself remain tied to the law in order to take the opportunity mentioned by St. Paul to become inordinately sinful, who would cast the first stone? But Sade went no further. It is not simply that his flesh is weak, as it is for each of us. It is that the spirit is too willing not to be deluded. His apology for crime merely impels him to an oblique acceptance of the law. The supreme being is restored in evil action. Listen to him, praise his technique of immediately implementing whatever comes into his head, thinking too that by replacing repentance with reiteration, he can be done with the law within. To encourage us to follow his example, he comes up with nothing better than the promise that nature, woman that she is, will magically give us evermore. We would be foolish to have faith in this typical dream of potency. It indicates to us clearly enough, in any case, that it cannot be true that Sade, as Klosowski suggests, all the while noting that he does not believe it, that Sade achieved the sort of apathy that involves, it cannot be true that Sade has achieved that sort of apathy that involves having returned to nature's bosom in the waking state in our world inhabited by language. And I have forbidden myself to say a word about what Sade is missing here. Let it be sensed in the climax of Philosophy in the Bedroom, it being the curved needle, dear to Buñuel's heroes, which is finally called upon to resolve in the girl a penis envy that is posited to some degree in it. In any case, it appears that nothing has been gained by replacing Diotima here with Dormance, a person whom the usual orifice seems to frighten more than is fitting, and who, did Sade see this, concludes the whole business with a sort of noli tangere matrem. Syphilized and sewn shut, the mother remains prohibited. My verdict is confirmed regarding Sade's submission to the law. There is thus precious little here, in fact nothing, by way of a treatise that is truly on desire. What is announced about desire here, in this mistake based on encounter, is at most but a tone of reason. And that's it.
Well, very good.
I think that at the end, the what is this called in English? The meaning of this story is that while Kant represses desire, Sade represses the law, right? He couldn't see the way in which they both meet, right? That's why Lacan says that in contrast to Klosowski, he doesn't see Sade to have neighborly relationships enough with himself, with his own evilness, right? To make it a law in that way, right? To reconcile these two opposites, right? And that's why at the end the mother is still prohibited, right?
Mother is still prohibited, and the supreme being is reconstituted in the body politic as necessary, which means that unlike Klosowski, I think Lacan is trying to say that de Sade does not get out of the problem of Christianity, which is a slight contradiction because before he was summarizing the Manifesto Onward Frenchman as saying, if you follow my maxims, we will instantiate a new epoch of desire. But then he closes it by saying that the whole treatise itself is bound up with reason, which I found very interesting. Akshay, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's saying that look at the way that Sade makes his argument, right? Like he doesn't say, look, I'm going to take things. He makes like a very reasonable argument. He's like, let's assume this maxim, let's think about universalizing it. And it's an education. Like none of the I think the claim that it's in the continuation of Christianity is like that what Sade is a moralist, right? Like it's
Right.
out of moral considerations that Sade wants to destroy the family.
Right.
Like why else, right? Like kind of.
Yeah. And then we have this question of the status of otherness in Christianity, which in a way, at least as we encounter St. Paul in the ethics seminar, I feel that we get something perhaps slightly of a different order of alterity. You know, this word referring to the whatever theological treatment of the other, because the maxim by which Christianity instantiates its law is not Kantian so much, it seems to me, because it's based in this conception of a presupposition that the status of the other is already whatever, like mired in evil or in otherness which cannot be integrated. But that becomes the maxim by which they must be loved. And then that becomes the basis of like social harmony, right? The ethics of the monstrous other. Which I don't see that exactly happening with Kant.
I mean, with Kant, it's similar because Kant says act in a way you expect others to also act, right? So there is this universality in which here in the way that we have, Lacan has been formulating the Sadian maxim, right? For example, in the case of murder, which is the one that he brings right now here, okay, there is the right to murder, right? Which means at the same time that you expect someone or you let someone else kill you, right? Which here, that's why Lacan thinks about, says that he rejects the death penalty, right?
Yeah.
Which means that he doesn't go to the end, like Sade doesn't go to the end with his maxims, right? He doesn't allow this reciprocity of, yes, you can kill, but you cannot kill me, right? So he doesn't go to the end.
I disagree with that quite a bit. Like I think if you look at the bottom, it's 666. There's but what must be kept in mind is that Sade himself refuses to be my neighbor, not so that I can refuse to be his neighbor in turn, but so as to recognize the meaning of his refusal here. And I think what's at stake is like moralism, right? Like Sade is like really concerned with sort of the freedom and autonomy of the human subject. And so he refuses neighborliness, right? Like in a kind of, and so, I mean, there's no inconsistency between his writings and his refusal of the death penalty.
I mean,
because-
read the next part. He says he doesn't have neighborly relationship with his own malice, right?
Yeah, I think that line means that, yeah, it's because he's not actually so bad a guy that he actually doesn't have a sense of original sin, right? Like he doesn't have the sense of like human badness. But I don't know. I mean, that's at least how I'm reading it.
I think it's interesting. I think Lacan, when he's like referring to original sin here, he's using like the chain, and that has, I think he's really invoking maybe unintentionally or not, Marx's Capital Volume 2, insofar as it uses like chains of equivalencies between, commodity, means of production, whatever, at any given point in the process of the circulation of capital. Sorry, I was walking around. Never mind, I'll leave it there.
I think we should.
I think
Oh.
part of this is a difficulty that once we get to this section, there's a pure commentary on Klosowski's Sade, My Neighbor. It's dealing with perceived inadequacies of Klosowski's conception of desire. So a lot of that is very particular, I believe, to Klosowski's book in a certain way. And I also think that we should break and we should talk about this in the future and do like a debrief perhaps, and even invite Luis to bring more of these schemas to bear.
Could I say?
Go ahead, Matilda, please, of
Yeah,
course.
I think I'd like to, try to understand what like the paper started with was that like de Sade's like practice, his ethical practice as like an academy became the conditions for Freud's discovery, probably of like the unconscious and repetition. I'm not sure exactly. I assume that's what it's about, but I would like to tie that up by the end of reading this somehow.
Mm-hmm. I think what it also references is the fusion between a science of sexuality, or like doing philosophy in the bedroom, the intersection of the discourse of the analyst to other discourses. I think it's also a reference to the discourse of the analyst itself and the status of that as but also I
Well,
think yep, go ahead.
I was gonna say
Yeah,
it's
go ahead.
interesting. It's interesting because I mean, in when he says that, that like he paved the way for Freud. Well, Freud has a theory of sexuality, but not necessarily a knowledge, to which it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, with the philosophy of the bedroom, there's a form of knowledge and education that is
Right.
instantiated. And Lacan in Seminar 16, in jouissance positive absolute, talks about all the ways in which the perception that people have about psychoanalysis is they think that it's a science of sexuality, or it's a body of knowledge of sexuality, when the reality is that what Freud discovered at the heart of sexuality is prohibition at the center, right? So it's about situating sexuality at the level of prohibition, to which Sade seems to pave the way by putting philosophy in the bedroom, right? And we put psychoanalysis, the analytic patient, which is the subject of science, on the couch, and we realize, what is repressed and what is prohibited at the sort of nucleus of sexuality.
Yeah.
I would also point us to the Freud event chapter from Seminar 16 too, where he brings up the ethics seminar and the whole point about how after Freud, there's like a different conception of, is it like the possibility of happiness as an ethical ideal or something? Which does seem to me like it does relate in some regards to like the death drive and repetition and stuff. I'll be curious to chat about it again.
Yeah, we should do so. We should also track down some of these references and even read Klosowski's text would be useful, I feel. And also The Humiliated Father, right, which I mentioned in my interview with Julie Reschi, if you remember, but it's referenced here from Claudel because it has something to do with kind of strange, almost like historicist claim about like almost like social fantasy and its relationship to an inevitable tragic conclusion. I find to be interesting and worthy of more discussion.
I think in the first part of the essay, right, it's
Yeah.
much simpler, right? What Sade introduces is the fact that there is no connection between morality and pleasure, right? And that's what makes more passable, as Lacan mentions, more passable Freud's pleasure principle, right?
Uh-huh.
Because
That's
if we
very well
think it
said.
in the classical way, it was, oh, the pleasure principle then is connected with the good. Of course not. Freud had no notion of goodness attached to the pleasure principle. Well,
Yeah, Louis.
conservation, yeah,
Yeah,
but
I mean,
no in any virtue sense.
when you're done with this paper, we could work to create like with the schemas like that kind of presentation of a summary of Kant with Sade that would be because like there's not many really solid, succinct summaries of this text. But the fact that you're working on it so much, like in time, maybe you could do that, or even like I'm happy to like record a lecture and we could post it. You know what I'm saying? Like you kind of walk through and show some of the schemas and the diagrams. That might be something to think about. It could be like a cool something to accompany your paper when it's finished.
I still promise you the Trump and Sade
Yeah, you have
paper.
to do that too.
Yeah, because I think it's connected with Seminar 16, right?
Yeah.
And there is the whole notion about perversion and neurotics and whatever, right? Because yeah, I mean it is different when perversion is on against the law and doesn't become the law, right?
One thing I'll say is that I was reading this secondary literature book that I posted about Bataille and de Sade and Lacan, and the author made an interesting little biographical point, which is that Lacan apparently attended some of the Acéphale secret mystical Nietzschean underground meetings of these guys. I was surprised to learn that. You know what I'm saying? Whatever they're doing in these crazy seances and Dionysian torture parties. Something like that. Okay, wow. Wow. Well, congratulations, everyone. This has been quite a journey. How do people feel? Pretty good?
Yeah.
No.
Well, what could you touch upon? I mean, not it's not. I mean, well, can you say a little bit more about Lacan in these like the you mentioned torture?
Oh, it was just a joke. Are
Oh, okay.
you aware of the Acéphale thing? Do you know what that is?
No, not at all.
Oh,
What's
okay,
that?
okay.
Secret society with Bataille and them.
Yeah, it's the French Nietzschean secret society that like Deleuze was inducted into, and he's like, yeah, they have eyes wide shut type thing. That's exactly what it is. It's a Nietzsche cult. It's the French Nietzsche cult, and Lacan attended these sessions. I've read a little bit about it. There's some things that are known about what their activities were. Anyways, I'll share more in the Discord, but I have to I got to bounce for dinner and sustenance purposes. I hope everyone has a great night. I'm sorry to close it, but somebody's got to perform the scansion, so I suppose it will be me. Thank you guys for this wonderful reading journey, and let's continue to chat about it. Peace out. Thank you all.